Welcome to Chelsea's Vocation. I'm Chelsea, and because I've raised two children on the autism spectrum into adulthood, I can't help but smile when I recognize autism in another human, especially a child. I've had the privilege as a parent professional to spend 2 decades studying this neurotype and learning how to better adapt my own behavior and the environment around autistic children to both encourage and foster their development. My hope through this podcast is that you might better understand how neurotypical people process your neurology if you're autistic, or how to do better yourself as someone who values autistic humans and your relationships with them. To be sure, I'm a lifelong learner. I expect us to learn lots of things from each other as we go along. But for these first 5 episodes, I'm going to let you know where I'm coming from. That way you can better decide whether Chelsea's Vocation is worth your time or not so much. Either way, I'm glad you're here now. Before I really kick this new podcast off, I want to thank my youngest, Noey buddy, for composing and producing the original track, Taking a Vocation, which you'll hear a few seconds of before and after this voiceover. Thanks to my favorite creative SOB, Tom Subcheck, for the photos you see in the intro wherever you can access the video version, as on the Chelsea's Vocation YouTube channel. And big appreciation to Megan Zweifel, another actually autistic artist, for the Chelsea's Vocation logo design. I wish to start our first episode with a bit of a disclaimer. What I'm talking about for the next 18 minutes or so is our family's history. These are the decisions my husband Pete and I made as parents, through research and prayer and tears. We didn't always choose well. We learned and we grew. We did better. My goal in sharing our story and in every episode of this podcast is to help you better understand your person's neurology even earlier than we did, so you can help your person become the best version of themselves and feel equipped with neuro-affirming concepts to promote wellness within and outside your personal space. If you're in the audience today as someone who supports families with autistic children, say you're an educator or a medical professional, I hope you learn to apply increasingly neuro-affirming practices and understand the family perspective, especially through these first 5 episodes. But hold on a minute, I'm already dropping some terminology that might not be familiar to you. So here we go with some explanations. First, I consider us a neurodiverse family, meaning there are several neurotypes represented, including those of the neuromajority, which also may be called the neuronormative, and these are folks with no diagnosable brain-based variant. That would apply to myself and my husband Pete. I also subscribe to the neurodiversity paradigm, which recognizes that there are many different ways a brain can be wired, so to speak. Characteristics are grouped together to form neurotypes. In our immediate family, which includes myself, my husband, and then our 2 now adult children, Justus and Noey, the most prominent neurotype is autistic. I look at autism, ADHD, and bipolar disorder, which are 3 diagnoses represented in Justus and Noey, as being part of the human experience. I don't look at this existence as a pathology that needs to be fixed, but I look at them as humans with individual support needs, just as every other human has. So to back up our story a little bit, Pete and I were high school sweethearts. As such, we ended up marrying young, and we started our family younger than we anticipated. It's not that we weren't planning to eventually start a family, but I always say, if you want to make God really laugh, put your plan out into the universe and see what happens. And we didn't expect our kids to have any neurological differences. It's nothing that we ever really considered as we first found out we were pregnant. In fact, our conversation between my husband and I would be that we would eventually homeschool our kids. We took a certain unwarranted pride in being first-generation college graduates on both sides of our family. We really looked at ourselves as a couple as cycle breakers. We were going to, have this committed marriage that was, of course, going to last forever. And we were going to be great and effective communicators between one another. We were definitely committed to our faith life, even before we got married. And we were an integral part of our church family. So these were all components that we thought we really had going for us as a young family. Early on in our marriage, I worked for a public relations firm. My husband worked in a food color lab. So neither of us was necessarily making huge bank when we found out we were pregnant. And we knew that, we would both have to continue working. And as I looked into childcare toward the end of my pregnancy, I realized there was no way we could afford childcare. So we worked out with my employer that I would telecommute. For those not of Gen X, this is what we called working from home in the late 1990s. And I would do that for the first 18 months of my son Justus's life. Eventually, I needed to resign to be able to care for him full time. But I was going to the office early in the morning and then coming home in the late morning so that my husband could go to his work in the lab, where he would stay until he would come home kind of mid-evening. So we would have a couple hours together as a family before we put our firstborn to sleep. I did that for about 18 months. And at that point, it was clear that I needed to be able to care for Justus full time. And I just couldn't swing working. So home I was, starting in the year 2000. My first inkling that Justus was different than his peers was when he was about 15 months old. I had registered for a lap sit story time at our local library that included infants from 15 to 18 months old. I noticed during that lap sit story time that it looked like Justus was honestly from another planet when I look back at it. He was not interacting with me the way that the other participants were interacting with their moms. He wasn't playing with the toys the same way that the other babies and toddlers were playing with their toys. And interestingly enough, I didn't find this out right away, but our pediatrician first noticed that Justus had something going on developmentally when he was 18 months old. It was just during a regular wellness visit. It was time to weigh Justus. He was in his diaper and started running down the hallway. And instead of stopping at the scale or looking back for me, he just kind of kept going. And the pediatrician looked at me and said, "So when does Justus turn around and look for you?" And I said, "What do you mean? He never turns around to look for me." So that was his first indication, apparently, that something was different about perhaps Justus's brain. I was pregnant with our number 2 shortly thereafter. I was asking the pediatrician how I might prepare Justus for the changes our family was going to go through very eminently, because at that point, Justus wasn't talking. He had just a couple of words, but had lost them by this point. At that time, the pediatrician referred Justus to a birth to 3 program. There was still no mention of any kind of diagnosis. Justus started a center-based intervention several days a week. When Noey was born, I started really pressing the pediatrician and birth to 3 for more information about Justus's development. We were at first referred to a pediatric behavioral health diagnostician who gave me the diagnosis of global developmental delay for Justus, and ultimately referred us to a different pediatric psychologist because Justus was too young to be seen. He was only 3. And then that pediatric psychologist decided that Justus had pervasive developmental disorder. So back under the DSM-4, pervasive developmental disorder was kind of the umbrella term for everything autism. And this psychologist really gave me a pretty grim prognosis of what Justus's future might look like. She said things like Justus would never have meaningful relationships, that he would never go to prom, he wasn't going to get married, he's not likely to have a job. The best we could probably hope for was to get him in a play group and hope that maybe he could talk. So that definitely colored the way that I was perceiving these so-called experts on my child. Ultimately, the pediatrician was on board with this pervasive developmental disorder diagnosis, but he didn't know anything about next steps to take. So you have to keep in mind, this is, back in 2002, Justus started an early childhood program We had moved in, we're in a well-resourced large public school district. And so through that early childhood program, he received OTPT in speech and had access to neurotypical peer models in that class. At that point, Dad, Pete, and our church family weren't really on board with this diagnosis. What that ended up meaning for me is I began to feel isolated and lonely and overwhelmed. I felt like I had this information from these so-called experts. I knew that something was different about Justus. I wasn't sure what to do with what they told me was going on. So we took Justus to a large autism intervention agency for what I was hoping was a clearer diagnosis and a better prognosis. At that point, this group declined care for Justus because they didn't believe he was a good candidate for growth with their intervention, which was applied behavioral analysis. I don't think they believed he would make enough progress at that point, and I didn't know what that meant. For some reason, I took that as, well, he's clearly not autistic enough for intervention. Meanwhile, Noey started showing signs of developmental delay. So the pediatrician referred her to Birth to 3 for intervention, which at that point was home-based. Noey's symptoms were totally different than Justus's, so at no point did autism cross my mind for Noey, even though she was getting OTPT and speech services in our home. The first person to kind of say autism in connection to Justus was his early childhood teacher, which I know is a huge blessing. So Miss Barb, if you're listening, thank you so much for being brave. Miss Barb encouraged me to seek a proper diagnosis through a pediatric neuropsychologist. And that worked out great. We got Justus's first official diagnosis of pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified. Again, under the DSM-4, this was one of the diagnoses under the autism umbrella. At that point, Justus was 4 years, 3 months old. With that diagnosis, we were able to get him enrolled in a Medicaid program here in Wisconsin called Katie Beckett. And also at that point, with Noey's developmental delays, we started kind of shopping her around for a diagnosis. We even considered at one point neurofibromatosis, which has nothing to do with autism, but with the developmental delays both kids had in these cafe au lait spots, there was a multidisciplinary team at our local children's hospital that took a look at that as a possibility and ultimately decided that wasn't what it is. So Justus did eventually get that in-home ABA therapy. That was the only Medicaid-covered intervention at the time. Back in the early 2000s, this was a full-time job for all of us. Justus was getting up to 40 hours of face-to-face in-home therapy. But the benefit to me, honestly, as a parent, was while Noey was napping, I could actually take a shower while Justus was with one of his line therapists and maybe even, gasp, eat a hot meal. So I was happy for the assistance. Noey was even included in some of the sessions, which I think was really helpful for us as a family to get them kind of interacting more on a sibling level and seeing what that might look like. Eventually, the supervising psychologist who would just kind of come and observe every 6 months to just see how the programs were going, she saw Noey stimming. So if you're familiar with autism, you might be familiar with self-stimulatory or self-regulating behavior that we often refer to as stims for short. And Noey, even as an infant, would flap her hands and kind of fix her gaze in a diagonal direction and maybe hum a little bit. The psychologist saw Noey doing this and said, so when are we going to diagnose her? And I said, with what? Because it didn't occur to me that she would have autism. But since we had been kind of shopping around for some kind of developmental diagnosis, I was intrigued. So at this point, Pete was starting to trust the process. Things were working out pretty well with Justus. He had a better understanding of what autism is, of my interest in making sure that our kids were given opportunities to become the best versions of themselves. Noey did get a preliminary diagnosis of Asperger's, again, under that autism umbrella in the DSM-4, from a pediatric diagnostician, but she was only 2 years, 9 months old. So because it was before age 3, that diagnosis was rejected by the Medicaid folks who determined eligibility. She was too young to get that diagnosis. So we waited. It was Noey's first neuropsych eval when she was 3 years, 4 months old, and she was diagnosed with Asperger's. now part of the autism spectrum, and also ADHD. And she started early childhood then when she was 3 years, 2 months old. So here we were with 2 kids on the autism spectrum, which doesn't seem strange now in 2025, but I'm telling you, back in 2005, that was kind of revolutionary. The doctors on the care team started to freak out and they said, hey, you need to go to genetic counseling. We want brain MRIs. We want spinal taps. Like they really wanted to make our kids human guinea pigs. So we weren't about to submit to all of that. We did end up going to genetic counseling. And at that point, even though there was no evidence of any genetic component to autism, the genetic counselors said that with 2 kids in the family with autism, we were very likely, if we had additional children, that they would be autistic. We made the decision, Pete and I, as a family, to not ever get pregnant again. And we were only 30 years old. So that was young to make that decision, but I believe that was the right decision for us because we felt equipped to be able to handle these 2 that God had given us in a way that would be most supportive of their healthy development. So meanwhile, I'm looking for support wherever I can get it. I ended up in a couple of support groups locally that met in person, and I didn't really vibe with them because to me, it felt like they were just packed with whiners. I was looking for people who wanted to take some kind of action, who were willing to try some solutions that seemed reasonable. I didn't want people around me who believed that my kids were broken or trapped or any of this kind of negativity that was floating around in the early 2000s about autism. I did find my best information through an online bulletin board. So if there are Gen Xers listening to this podcast right now, do any of you moms remember iVillage? It was a big thing back in the day. Anyway, they had a board for people with pervasive developmental disorder, for their parents. This is where I started getting information about clearly this runs in families and the different things that folks were trying to get their kids to have their best quality of life. I started showing up at local parent meetings with a 3-ring binder packed with resources. I was kind of like, if you were ever a fan of Parks and Recreation and you knew the character Leslie Knope, she would show up. She loved her 3-ring binders, and that was me. So I would come kind of packed with resources for other people who wanted solutions, who wanted ways to kind of get their kids and their families tapped in. And eventually one of these parent meetings was a school district parent-led information network for families of students with special education needs. And it was really through that group that I started to form my tribe. It was at that point that our family autism flag was pinned to the top of the pole. I was all in on this form of our identity. Justus ends up going to our neighborhood school for kindergarten. Noey finally gets approved for Katie Beckett. Noey ends up entering into some ABA. Justus starts seeing a pediatric psychiatrist because his behaviors are becoming more troubling. He's put on medication, which ultimately gives him some manic behavior. And that ends up landing him in a psychiatric hospital and diagnosed with bipolar disorder. You're going to hear more about Justus's journey in episode 2. We'll focus on Noey's journey in episode 3, more personal about my evolution in episode 4, and you'll hear more about Pete in episode 5. My hope is that in these expositions, something will resonate with you. Maybe you'll recognize yourself, maybe you'll recognize your person, or maybe someone in your family or tribe. The topics I've chosen for episodes 6 and beyond are based on what I've learned about Justus and Noey and how I've seen these aspects of neurodivergence play out across the last 2 decades of my life as a parent and professional, visiting hundreds of schools and community groups, reaching tens of thousands of people with a message of acceptance. I extend a heaping portion of gratitude to my grown-up children and my husband who have generously permitted me to share our collective experiences in order to confer some benefit to you. May God be with us all as we journey together.